This afternoon, the January 6th committee released another trove of transcripts from interviews conducted with 16 witnesses during its investigation. We now know in the days after the January 6th attack, Trump Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin began looking into the process of removing Trump from office by Googling the 25th Amendment. Mnuchin also admitted discussing the 25th Amendment on at least one occasion with Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. We also learned from these new transcripts that in the days after January 6th, Trump asked his labor secretary, Eugene Scalia, who Scalia thought was the most loyal member of the cabinet. Quote, "I thought the appropriate answer was me. And so I said, I am, Mr. President," Scalia told investigators, eliciting laughter in the room. Scalia also recounted how Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao called him on the night of January 6th about her plans to resign. He told the committee, quote, "I think that she believed that in one manner or another, the president's conduct prior to the attack on the Capitol had contributed in one way or another to what happened at the Capitol, and that disturbed her." The transcript of Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger says he felt Donald Trump's infamous phone call, asking him to find 11,000 votes, was a threat. And Raffensperger thought Trump's followers would carry out that threat if he did not comply. But perhaps the most interesting thing we learned from these transcripts today was, again, from the January 6th committee's star witness, Cassidy Hutchinson, former aide to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. This is part of a newly released transcript of her interview with the committee's vice chair, Liz Cheney. Quote, "Liz Cheney, did you see Mr. Meadows put documents in his fireplace?" Cassidy Hutchinson, "Yes, ma'am." "Ms. Cheney, and do you know what the documents were?" Hutchinson replies, "I don't know." Liz Cheney, "How frequently did you see him do this?" Ms. Hutchinson, "I mean, it's hard. I want to say once a week or twice. I can recall specific times that I did, maybe a dozen, maybe just over a dozen, but this is over a period December through mid-January." Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows was regularly throwing White House documents into the fireplace in the period directly before and after January 6th. Now, we don't know what was in those documents that Mark Meadows was burning, but Cassidy Hutchinson does go on to describe several instances in which Meadows burned documents right after meeting with Pennsylvania Republican Congressman Scott Perry, Trump ally who reportedly sought a pardon from Trump for his role in trying to overturn the election. Quote, Ms. Hutchinson, quote, "I know between 2 and 4 times Meadows had Mr. Perry in his office right before burning the documents." Ms. Cheney, "Do you know what Mr. Perry was talking to him about?" Ms. Hutchinson, "Election issues." Liz Cheney, "Anything more specific than that?" Cassidy Hutchinson, quote, "The vice president's role on January 6th. Joining us now, Politico congressional reporter Nicholas Wu. Nicholas, thank you so much for being here. I got to tell you, that mental image of Mark Meadows just burning documents in a White House fireplace after meeting with Congressman Scott Perry, it sticks out. I wonder what you make of the revelations from today's transcripts.
Well, what that particular instance that we learned about today really brings into the public record something that we had only heard about before. We at Politico had previously reported that particular incident, but it's much more powerful to see it on the record from Hutchinson in these transcripts. And at the same time, to me, what these transcripts reveal is the limitations of some of the January 6th committee's investigation. We never heard from Mark Meadows himself directly, so we can't ask, the committee was never able to ask him about what was in those documents. The committee never heard directly from Republican members of Congress. So Congressman Scott Perry was never specifically asked in that setting about those documents. And so, the torch here in some ways is passed on to DOJ, which is carrying on the investigative mantle of the committee. And we know that the DOJ already sees Congressman Scott Perry's phone as part of its larger investigation into January 6th. And so it remains to be seen exactly how that will all shake out.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute with Barb McQuaid. But I want to ask you, one of the things that came to light today was sort of this bizarre meeting with members of the House Intel Committee at the White House. For those who didn't pore over these documents today, can you just explain, recap what happened?
So there's this bizarre sequence that Hutchinson describes where it appears that there were these Republican members of the House Intelligence Committee who were bringing these documents into the White House and then, trying to pass them on to folks there. And Hutchinson testified that, these were very closely held, so closely held, in fact, that, when Meadows tried to get copies of them to Leader McCarthy, and McCarthy didn't actually want them. We don't actually know the substance of these documents, but the time frame kind of lines up with the Russia investigation and when Trump, might have been trying to mass declassify documents. And so, again, this is where we run into some of the same issues with the rest of the committee's investigation. They weren't quite able to penetrate every single barrier that was thrown up, and this is kind of a black box for them.
Well, to that point, Trump has promised pardons to Capitol rioters if he was reelected. I wonder what you made of the revelation in one of the transcripts that Trump asked Pat Cipollone for blanket pardons for people involved in the Capitol attack.
That was a pretty startling revelation as well. Johnny McEntee, who'd been a body man at the White House at one point, and at that point in time, was pretty close to the president, in charge of personnel at the White House. He testified about hearing that Trump had floated blanket pardons for people who had been involved in nonviolent actions at the Capitol on January 6th, and the White House counsel pretty quickly shot that down. And it tracks with a lot of other reporting that we'd heard from the White House at that time, and reporting that we've seen, in the last 2 years or so. But at the same time, this is part of the January 6th committee's addition to the historical record, being able to see this sworn testimony from members of the president's inner circle about what was happening in those chaotic days after the attack.
And a lot of the intrigue is in the details. I wonder, as someone who has actually gone through this page by page, what else stuck out to you?
Well, what stands out to me are some of the interesting little vignettes that we see that, aren't necessarily bombshells like that, but, as someone who's been watching politics over the past few years, just helped to shed a lot more light. So, for example, former White House press aide Judd Deere had testified about this kind of bizarre twist at the end of the Trump administration. Normally, there's a daily schedule they put out, and it changed in those last weeks of the Trump administration to just say the president was taking many meetings and taking many calls. And Deere testified it was because Trump found out that the White House daily schedule was in fact public, and he wanted to change that. And that solved one of those kind of bizarre mysteries from the end of the administration.
So many bizarre mysteries yet unsolved. Politico congressional reporter Nicholas Wu. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us.